Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show. Yes, we have another guest. This time, though, it's by popular demand. A question we get all the time is, okay, you keep throwing poll numbers at us, but what does it mean for this election or that election? I keep saying it will be a change wave everywhere. And yes, I mean everywhere. Here to talk about how everywhere it's going to be, we welcome our friend Brandon Jones. Brandon is the director of political campaigns at the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund and New Southern Majority, where they have some really exciting races. Brandon, welcome.
Really good to be with you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Alex, where do you want to get started, my friend?
I mean, we got a ton. The whole thing, and Joe and I have been saying, Brandon, for to catch you up, Joe and I have been saying for months that this is really going to be a wave year, but not the blue wave, more like a change wave that's really going to sweep everywhere. And Joe was in Iowa a couple weeks ago, was on the ground talking to most of the candidates there, like Zach Walls, and just showing exactly how far this thing is going to go. Obviously, for the listeners, we've worked with Brandon on various projects over the years, and including now trying to figure out where some of the winnable places that Democrats traditionally might have written off or even abandoned, I think is probably a fair way to put it. Obviously, we're on the same team in 2017 for Doug Jones's historic victory. And since then, kind of had some interesting ones. So Brandon, before there's some news actually that people haven't heard from the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund this week. That's a poll I want to get to, but where do you want to start?
No, I think that's perfect. We've been in the news a little bit, and excited to demonstrate that we're moving along. There's a lot of important work to be done, and we're excited to be putting one foot in front of the other. And thank you all for the chance to talk a little bit about some places that people might not be thinking about.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, the we can win every, Brandon, I'm trying to think, over the last couple of cycles, even I'd actually say the last 12 months, some races that we've talked about that they were like, oh, whoa, this is something we can carry forward. Joe and I go deep into like exit polls in Virginia and New Jersey and talk about things like where double haters are and what that means for next year. But there are some real wins in the South. I mean, everything from some elections in Mississippi to both of the Public Service Commission races in Georgia that were the first statewide Democratic non-federal wins in forever, and a lot that New Southern Majority has been involved with too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one thing I appreciate about both of you've both been longtime advocates of really looking over all of our 50 states for opportunities. These things are more available than people think. If anyone who's been following races closely, as you just mentioned, will see that there have been some really important wins, and there have been some really important close calls that suggest further investment is important. For us, what we typically do is look for opportunities in the deep South, in these five Southeast states that are right in the bottom right-hand corner of the country. And last year, we were a part of 11 independent expenditure campaigns and helped to win 9 of them. And in 5 of those instances, it resulted in the first time that a Black person had been elected mayor of their community. So that's the kind of stuff we look for. And of course, here today, we're talking about another very close statewide race in Mississippi. I met Joe about 15 years ago as we were trying to recruit candidates for the legislature in Mississippi. And so, Joe, I've always appreciated the fact that you've always had places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana on your mind and looked for opportunities to elevate good candidates. And I think we might have another opportunity to have some good times this year.
That's great because I enjoyed it down there, but it's always been rough. And although I think, you've seen progressively Mississippi's gotten more and more and closer to victory in each cycle, even as, Trump was ascending and that we're coming down the escalator. It's gotten stronger. And I think you're right. It looks to me like we got a competitive race this time in Mississippi in the Senate.
Yeah, and just for people who might not be aware, 3 out of 4 of the last hotly contested races in Mississippi are inside of 5 points.
Mhm.
One race you know very well, 2018, Mike Espy versus Senator Hyde Smith, a
Yeah.
1 point race on the first ballot. Um, in 2019, the following year, you had a 5 point gubernatorial election where Jim Hood came very close that year to beating Tate Reeves. And then just a couple years ago, 2023, that was a 3 point race in the battle for governor. And 27,000 voters is what that margin meant. And when you get down to 27,000, that's a pretty manageable
Yeah,
spreadsheet.
that's a week.
I mean, that's close.
Yep.
I mean, if you look at and for our listeners here, we said pretty early on, I know Joe is big on Iowa from the beginning, and now everybody nationally is saying don't sleep on Iowa. I think actually if you go look at like the prediction markets, some of them have Democrats at like 73% to win the Iowa governor's race. So I mean it just went like this. I'm I am here to tell you today that Democrats can win the Senate seat in Mississippi. And I think we'll walk you through why, but it's such a Joe, I was talking to a mutual friend pollster of ours who said essentially, you know, this is not something that is just happening in one place. If it's happening there, it's happening everywhere and vice
Yep.
versa. And if you just look at these numbers, I mean, first of all, I encourage everyone go check out the Economist Trump approval tracker, and I say that for a reason. Right now, they have Trump as -8 in Mississippi, which we'll get back to with some national numbers and then come back. But to set the stage, even in a place that I think everyone would probably call deep red in years past, even though, as Brandon just pointed out, the electoral results have not necessarily backed that up, even Trump is underwater there, largely due to finally, some just cratering with African Americans and independents, but also a decent amount of white suburban voters. So, I mean, Joe, if you look at the national numbers, which I know you and I were kicking around this morning, his approval rating as we're recording this has basically never been lower. It is 33, 67 approve, disapprove, and it's bad with Republicans too.
But you can't get this is the whole thing on how low can this go, because when you're down to 23% approval among independents, 76% disapprove among independents. And you point out that it's only 68% of Republicans approve, 31 disapprove.
But that's bad.
Disapprove.
That's really bad.
Yeah, that's like horrible. But my point is, it's the 23. You and we've been talking about this since November in Jersey and Virginia, and when we saw 60 something, 70% of independents voting with the Democrats in New Jersey and Virginia. This it's starting to show up everywhere, but it was the first signs of this were last November, and now it's showing up again nationally, and I think it's showing up in places like Alabama and Mississippi as well. And so you look at those economist numbers. I didn't even look at I saw the Mississippi numbers when I was in Iowa several weeks ago. He had fallen to -12% there.
-14 now. It's
Now it's
getting worse.
-14. So again, it's accelerating. I didn't know that those. No, I hadn't had time, Alex, to check where they had moved since the last time when we looked, but they're still moving. And my guess is that's all these independents and some now Republicans, because Democrats have always been at this 97 disapprove, 3 or 4 or 5% approve. Although that's gotten down too, because that used to be 5, 6, 7% approved. Even among Democrats, that's collapsing too. So there's nothing there. I don't know how much lower it can go, though. Once you get to 33 overall and 23 with independents, excuse me. But what's significant is it is places like Iowa, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. It's happening everywhere, all 50 states.
Yeah, and we're seeing that it's not. I think there's a hard data point that's maybe worth mentioning before we even talk about this poll out of Mississippi. In the March 10th primary, we saw parity among the parties in their turnout, which is unusual in a situation where both parties have candidates. For years and years, Democrats had a hard time getting over the 87,000 number for participation whenever Republicans had a competitive primary. And this year it was nearly even, very similar to what we saw in Texas. So it's not just theoretical. It's not just vibes. I mean, people want to do something and they're showing up.
Well, and this is one more national thing before we drill into Mississippi, because I think it does apply. Joe sent me this yesterday, but the Elliot Morris's group, Strength in Numbers, just did a Verisite poll that basically one of the theories that Joe and I went into at length a couple weeks ago is Democrats are mad at Democrats too, for different reasons than they're mad at Trump, and part of that is showing up in some of these numbers. This new data suggests or very clearly points out that that has resolved itself. I mean, they to quote them, when we ask voters whether they think Democrats or Republicans possess certain character traits, Democrats win on nearly everyone we tested. Independents dislike Republicans roughly 3 times as much as they like Democrats. Even voters who say they have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party often plan to vote for Democrats anyway. And the complaint that, these groups start coming up, it's not that there's it's the complaint is that they're not fighting hard enough against Trump, which is not, that is not a voter who is going to this fall stay home when they know that this is their best shot to take it to them. So with that context, this Mississippi, I mean, Brandon, when we talked about it on the phone the other day, I about stood up out of my chair reading some of these numbers. I mean, where do you want to go? It is wild.
Well, the one that just jumps off the page for me is that 53% of the folks we spoke with want somebody other than their sitting senator. I mean, that's something that we're seeing bad numbers, but that's an incredibly bad number for someone who's been in office for a long time, whose name ID is 95%. And so just in the way of context setting, we did this poll on behalf of SPLC Action Fund. We tried to get our best guess at what a general electorate would be. And, as you've mentioned, as both of you have mentioned, we see incumbent Republicans struggling across the board, but 53% saying that they would like to elect someone other than their current senator is just pretty striking to us. And then, as you go down the list, a couple other things to note here for us was that there was a 3-point difference between the Democrat and the Republican at the first pass through. There is a third party candidate in this race. Since that candidate had run twice as a Democrat, the expectation was that person would be drawing votes from Democratic voters, but in fact, seems to be serving as sort of a repository for disgruntled Republicans who intend to participate, but really don't like their incumbent senator. And of course, as we've seen everywhere else, things like cost of living and inflation are just running away with the storyline. Healthcare costs rated really high among concerns for voters. And I think, to your point you were making a moment ago, Alex, I think it's always a mistake for the political class to pat themselves on the back too much when they see figures like this. A lot of this has to do with mismanagement of geopolitical issues. A lot of it has to do with incompetency of the current administration and down the line. But I will credit folks like Scott Colomb, the candidate in Mississippi, and other Democrats across the country for properly centering the economy and cost of living issues within how they're talking to voters right now, because that clearly is what is moving people.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think is clear, I just see it everywhere, is independence, and you can see it in those numbers: 33% nationwide approval of Trump, 23 with independents. I mean, in other words, it's higher within. I mean, that's bigger than the population, and it just seems to me that across the board, it's all adding up. I mean, obviously, affordability, the war in terms of the way its impact on gas prices, all those things, is further, like you said, incompetence, or just cruel, like going for it every time, has layered up in which literally the independents are gone. I don't see how the incumbent senators that have enabled it are going to um, somehow, be able to duck and not take the wrath of those, not just the Democrats, but the independents. That's why everybody out there keeps talking about the blue wave. I don't see this as a blue wave anymore. This is something where when you get to 68% approval among Republicans, it's a change wave. It's bigger and cresting a lot higher with a lot more power than just Democrat. I mean, this is Democrats, independents, and now Republicans, enough of them joining that sort of like need for change to turn the page on what's going on in the country right now in terms of their economic future, their economic reality today, the rising costs, and just the chaos that I think is adding up to these kind of things where you suddenly have a race where the sitting senator in Mississippi is literally sitting on a bubble and can be beaten. And so we now everybody's saying don't go to sleep on Iowa. Alex and I've been urging people not to go to sleep on Iowa for a couple months now. But you can't go to sleep on Mississippi, and helping in these races, the kind of races that Alex and I, look, when people called and said, "Hey, will you come down and help us talk Doug Jones into running in 2017 in Alabama?" Most people would have said what a lot of people in Washington were saying is, "Hell no, no one's won anything in Alabama in 25 years. Not going to waste our time." We dove in, and we've been there with you in Mississippi. And I think people need if you want to help, there are some races in Alabama, Mississippi, Florida that really are going to matter, and I think all of them are winnable if we get them the resources and the help they need.
After Joe's great ask there, I do want to just point something out that I think might be buried. This is not some pie in the sky if everything happens and 200,000 magical new Democrats move to the state and all decide to vote and all bring their friends and all of a sudden. No, this poll had a plus 13 generic. And what that means is 47% of people normally vote Republican and only 34% in this sample vote for Democrats. So you turn that around, and right now, Cindy Hyde-Smith is 20 points underwater. That is the clearest indication of throw the bums out you can see. If you've got 47% of Republicans, people who usually vote Republican, and she's only polling 33% right now, before we even get into any attacks, any positives on the Democrat Scott Colon, which we'll get to in a minute, she's already down 13%. And remember that Trump approval rating I talked about? I think he's at 52. I think you have him at like plus 13, plus 12 or plus 13. So she's like 35 points below Trump. And by the way, that plus 12, I'm kind of thinking it might be a little generous. I realize The Economist has him 8 points underwater, but it's not going to be more than 12. Might be less, it might be 12. But even in these conditions that I would say are a fairly conservative look at this electorate in the midst of a change wave, after persuasion, which, by the way, the cool thing is we're actually going to have the resources to do it, thanks to groups like New Southern Majority, etc. She's losing by 10. It's 44-34, and it's never really that close. So you add all this up, and this is my point about it really is everywhere. You look at places like Texas where this is happening. You look at Alaska. You look at Iowa. You look at Ohio. If Mississippi is in play, folks, and it is, and we need to all perk up, a lot of those other places are not just in play, but we should feel real good about where we are in the Senate.
Yeah, and they don't really have anywhere to go, do they? I mean, as you described the situation here, if you're an incumbent Republican senator, where do you go? What do you play to? There's not really a way to fix any of this. And I don't know about you guys. I mean, I know we live in a changing world and we see this stuff pretty chaotic on a daily basis, but it's hard to imagine a lot of these indicators right sizing before people go to the poll.
No,
Um,
it's not. I don't think you're going to see. Look, whether it's Iran gas prices going up, none of these things are going to change dramatically between now and November. Uh, even if they go well, and a lot of these things you got to hope they do go well, but
sure.
that's not the point politically. Um, People are going to be experiencing the hardship caused by this, erratic and chaotic mess. And again, from people who promised that they lower prices on day one, none of that's going to change. And not only that, I think you're right, Brandon, because part of the problem they now have within the Republican Party is there's sort of two schisms. I mean, there's multiple schisms, but one is you told us you weren't going to get us into any of these forever wars, which is why a lot of MAGA supported him. At the same time, there's a huge group within the party who thinks ICE hasn't been brutal enough, or that we should be, that you shouldn't stop the bombing in Iran. We should end their civilization. I mean, there's this schism of people who want to go even further and people who just want it all to stop in his own. If you're the senator and you basically agree with continuing with some of the overblown stuff, you may get MAGA, but look at the independents and everybody else you've pushed away. And if you embrace him and the harsher things that he's doing right now and that you've enabled, you may get MAGA, but it's just there's not enough votes there. This is even a place like Mississippi and Alabama and in Florida where you're seeing competitive, in Texas too. Look, this all reminds me of 1980 in the opposite. Back then, Carter was president. We had double-digit interest rates, inflation, the misery index, gas lines. The Iran hostage situation was raging, and going into the election with Reagan, and this was a presidential year, so that's one big difference. But it was Ray. You had going into that election, there were two or three Democrats who had polling that said in the Senate that said they were in trouble. That night, eight or nine got shown the door, six of whom no one saw coming. I mean, back then we didn't have the kind of polling, everywhere that we're seeing today. So maybe we're starting to see a glimpse of that. But that night, no one thought, I mean, I still believe in November of this year, there will be Republicans losing their Senate seats who we are not talking, even as we talk about Mississippi and some of these other places, several of them that we're not talking, there's going to be places that we're just going to be surprised by how bad a night November is going to be if we get people the resources and the ability to organize and fight everywhere. It is really tough to see how they pull back from what's coming.
Yeah, I believe that wholeheartedly. I just think the gravitational pull of all of these factors is going to create some really interesting outcomes. And I think you see candidates in places that are harder to win, taking advantage of the moment. And I just was thinking as you were talking about the first congressional district in Mississippi, which is that northernmost district where you have a guy from the MacArthur Justice Project who's a law professor at Ole Miss, Cliff Johnson, who's running hard in the first district and getting some attention and, staking out a reasonable position. I was thinking about 2006 too, Joe, because I just recall the malaise that had kind of set in. And whenever you're talking about these things and people who are typically reliable Republican voters, when they're really not putting up a policy-oriented fight for the way things are, they're changing the subject to baseball season,
Yeah.
or well, gas isn't too bad at Costco. To me, that kind of feels like there's an awareness that's starting to
Yeah.
settle in.
I kind of think if you were to ask some of the saner Republican strategists, and I realize that there aren't as many as there used to be, uh, if you said right now, we'll give you 2020 or 2006 numbers, which was 5 seats in the Senate and 31 seats in the House, I think some of them might take that because it's looking like more than that right now.
Well, and then you had a rational head of government that was willing to give individual candidates the latitude to do the things they needed to do to win. You know, this dynamic within the current MAGA party just doesn't allow for jazz. It doesn't allow for a candidate like Cindy Hyde-Smith to break from the administration on, tariffs, or to talk about beef and soybeans and those issues that are really close to the heart of people living in central Mississippi. It doesn't allow for a whole lot of freedom to wax poetic about why we might need to take a different approach to Iran. And there's just not a whole lot of space for that in this current environment.
The other thing I think that's happening, though, too, alongside everything that Trump is doing, is you're starting to see in places like Iowa, Mississippi, Alabama, where one party's been essentially ruling the roost forever, where corruption and those kinds of things you're starting to see voters citing things like corruption even ahead of things like affordability and gas prices. In other words, the sort of the one party nature of the way they run everything is actually also, I think somehow Trump is his own corruption has sort of exacerbated that or somehow amplified people, locally starting to look at their state leaders and the state government in a kind of like throw them all out kind of, angst out there. That's where everybody is sort of at that place where they just want to like turn the page, and if you're in, they want to throw you out. That's going to hurt a lot of these Republicans in these places, in these one party state, or where it's mostly been one party. I know there's exceptions; somebody wins now and then, but I think corruption is also starting to really seep in places like Mississippi and Alabama.
Yeah, I'm not terribly old, but I was actually part of a Democratic majority in the Mississippi House not too long ago. So, but your point's well taken. And what we saw in our poll was that corruption, once you got past cost of living, inflation, and those
Right.
economic issues, that corruption was second top priority for people. And I think that speaks to what you're referring to there. I mean, um,
Yeah.
yeah, one party rule for a period of time has this sort of impact.
Yeah, well, I think maybe Iowa and Alabama are better examples of that than Mississippi, given your recent experience. But I just think there's that kind of when you get this thing where Republicans have won statewide every, for the last few
Yeah,
3, 4 cycles, you get this. They're well, first of all, either party's susceptible to this, right? You
sure.
own everything, you overdo it, and you go off the rails. And I think given Trump again, that thing, the same thing that you were talking about that was a problem for her, you know, uh, it worked to be basically enabling Trump and going along with whatever he wanted, and while people were still not yet kind of going negative and feeling some of the adverse effects. Now they're feeling so many of them, and they've been enabled by state and local governments in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Iowa. I mean, in Iowa, they literally the one Democrat who won, Rob Sand in 18 and 22, the auditor's office. The first thing the Republican governor and the legislature did, because he was the only Democrat who's ever won statewide last like 8 years, was to remove and strip the Auditor General's office of any power to investigate, to audit, to do anything. I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. They
Yeah,
do things
yeah,
like that that signal to everybody wait a minute, what the hell? This is corrupt. Something's going on here. And I think that's what I'm saying. I think there's been enough of that in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Iowa that it on top of Trump and what he's been doing in that regard, insider trading and poly markets and all those kinds of things, I think it's somehow seeping down and really repelling independence in a way that, that's I think amplified somehow.
Yeah, there's something that upsets our feeling of fairness and,
Yeah.
all these kind of general civics sentiments. There's a guy in North Mississippi, a county clerk, who likes to say, we're playing checkers and they're playing football. And when you have that happening long enough, you have the same results at the polls. You don't put on a bumper sticker, you probably don't crochet this on a pillow, but when these environments coalesce, sometimes having that one party rule can kind of be to your advantage in a setting like this. I mean,
That's sort of what I'm saying. I really think that it's even more powerful in a place Mississippi, Alabama. I mean, these places where they think they've got it all and can do what they want, and they're about to find out people are no, it's not gonna work out that way. And they may be kind of so disabused of having to worry that I'm not sure. Do you think she feels like she's in trouble?
there's a carelessness that settles in. I think there are muscles that you use when you're having to fight for every vote and when you're having to sincerely communicate to independent voters that is different than what happens when you can run, a campaign where you just kind of stay at home
Yeah.
and let things play out. And so those muscles start to atrophy a little bit. And I think we've seen that here. I think, whenever you see Senator Hyde Smith, who I have known since her days in the state legislature, when she was a Democrat from Brookhaven, by the way, you just kind of see almost either an unwillingness to engage or just kind of lost at sea when faced with different things. It wasn't that long ago. I think it's just been a few weeks when she was being asked about the high cost of beef. And she said, well, there are just so many proteins to choose from. And I thought, well, that is not the sound of a United States senator from the state of Mississippi. That sounds like somebody who's a little out of practice. And so I do think you start to take things for granted and you lose some of that sharpness that you need to win competitive elections.
So, Brandon, we're getting close to time here, but wanted to talk about some of the other work that New Southern Majority and the Action Fund are doing. Any other things we should keep our eye on as we start getting into this summer here with elections?
Yeah, well, our bread and butter in New Southern Majority is to work on local elections. There's one thing that we feel is that progressives were not quick enough to shift to growing local talent,
Mhm.
to looking to help out in mayor's races, to help out in county commissioner races. School boards have become a major battleground in this country, unfortunately. Probably nothing more important that we do than providing good public education across the country. And so making sure that we have good school boards is something that we pay a lot of attention to. And so we will absolutely be playing in school board races in Florida and Georgia this year. Those are important, and there are some school boards at stake. We're also looking at Alabama, where we've mentioned him once. Doug Jones is running for office, and I don't think there's anybody who sort of has spoken to the issues of what we've been talking about, and from a policy perspective, quite like Doug has. And so to have him on the ballot is a big deal. Tommy Tuberville is a flawed candidate, let's say, and so I think there's a lot to work with. We haven't polled that race yet, but I suspect we would see a lot of the same things. A lot of Alabamans that are looking for door number 3 or for some alternative, and so those are some of the races we're going to be looking at this year. We try to do, Alex, at least 10 independent expenditures, and we focus on Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. So yeah, we're happy to be already spending money in Mississippi, and as soon as those June deadlines pass for candidate qualification and some of those other places, we'll be figuring out where to help out.
Well, Joe, I think we're just about out of time. Brandon, thanks for coming on, brother. I know this kind of came together quickly when this poll dropped.
Yeah,
This is great.
and hopefully Alex will let me see a copy of it. Anyway, thanks, Brandon, for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening to or watching That Trippi Show. We'll include a link to where you can support the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund, and the new Southern Majorities Vital Work. Make sure to join us at sez.us. It's a civil social network for human beings, not bots. We're algorithm driven. This podcast will always be free and is part of Lincoln Square, so check out the latest at lincolnsquare.media. Also, if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please like and subscribe to get alerts when we post the next episode. You can always send us a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com. Alex, if he deems it's an important enough question, he'll actually ask me it on the show, which he did not do today. So keep sending them, and maybe Alex will get to them. And you can always send us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week. Brandon, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much.